thank you so much for hosting me today. Thank you to Priya for this opportunity, and thank you to everyone giving up your grand final viewing. It is with a little bit of irony, then I had a little bit of smirk on my face when I made the connection that this presentation was happening on grand final day. I am in Victoria, but as a Brisbane gal at heart, I might possibly be one of the very few people who, quite frankly, doesn't give a damn about the footy. But thank you for joining me anyway, and on grand final day to talk public relations ethics. My name is Dr Michaela Jackson. I am from RMIT University, and I am presenting today on behalf of my co-authors, Ella and Marianne as well. Before I get any further, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands RMIT conducts its business. RMIT respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders past, present and emerging, and we also acknowledge traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. So, as you probably saw in the title slide, we are talking public relations ethics today. And I guess the question that is framing our discussion is, what is the state of public relations ethics research and scholarship in the 21st century? I'm going to keep things purposefully simple, and I guess following a classic kind of academic presentation structure today. And this is done quite purposefully, as is the fact that I hope to wrap up in about 20 or 30 minutes. And that's because I really want to try and encourage some good hard thinking, some knitting of the brows, and perhaps some lively discussion towards the end as well. So our presentation today draws on a systematic review of academic scholarship and research in regard to the topic of public relations ethics. And we will be presenting very briefly the context and the methods that we used, and then really going into some of the findings that resulted from this study before we ask some of those pointy questions at the end around so what? So what does this mean for us as academics and as a profession as well? Because I am quite keen to foster some discussion towards the end, my preference would be if you could hold questions until the end. Look, I'm not going to kind of exit stage left or anything like that if you don't, but I just think it will probably work better as a presentation as a whole. Now, I've got some images, some screenshots of different news articles that have crossed my desk in the past probably 12 to 18, maybe 24 months. And by means of background, perhaps you would be aware that unfortunately there seems to be these examples of perhaps controversial or questionable behaviour that can implicate public relations. And I choose the word implicate there quite purposefully. I'm not saying that public relations is the cause or to blame, but somehow it seems like our discipline often can get caught up in these kinds of controversies. So a few examples there, looking at things like James Ashby being filmed seeking $20 million from the NRA, to me speaks to these ongoing questions around the ethics of lobbying. It seems like every second day there's a data breach where people's information is perhaps being used inappropriately. I'm talking about big data, some of the questions associated with AI and how AI is being used. And that includes a whole range of applications, including, as that article there talks about, AI and fake news. Now, I think, you know, if you've watched the ABC recently, you may have seen Belle Gibson pop up in terms of her dubious antics as an influencer. Unfortunately, some government agencies, as we can see in the top centre there, have also been caught up in these kinds of implications or these kinds of scenarios. And you might ask yourself, well, that's not public relations' fault. Well, no, I would agree with you there, but oftentimes we as public relations professionals might be engaged by a client to in turn develop campaigns that use these influencers. So there can be, as I said, not necessarily us to blame, but there can be some implications there for us. So more broadly, I think this is unfortunately creating a situation where public attitudes towards public relations and the negative framing of the industry continue to present some concern for us in the industry, and particularly I think it can be a cause of frustration for those of us who do some fantastic work or who know what public relations really can be about, to be sort of portrayed negatively in a more public domain. So I guess switching from professional practice and what might be in the public eye to getting a little bit more academic here, and it only seems appropriate that I have a nice text-dense slide with lots of references in it at this point. But at the same time, we know from public relations scholarship that ethics is seen, as Bowen tells us there, as a vital principle of public relations. And indeed, ethics remains an enduring topic of discussion within the public relations literature. You don't have to look very hard to see just a really rich and growing body of research and discussion around ethics. In addition to that, we also know that there are some lofty normative principles, such as contextual intelligence and boundary spanning, that really recommend that public relations professionals remained attuned to the environment that they function in. So the idea of open systems as well comes into play here. Now, if we add a little bit more to the mix at this point, because, you know, those 2 points aren't enough by themselves, we also know that in past decades, I would say particularly since about the turn of the century, there has been some pretty considerable social change and economic change, even transformation across a range of really, I guess, important spheres in our broader society. So as it says there, socio-economic, technological, political and cultural transformation is going on. So combining these ideas together, we know that ethics is important. We know that as a profession, we have these normative principles, but we also know that we're in the midst of a state of change. So public relations as a discipline, it's probably not too much of a stretch to say, needs to engage in these changing contexts and adopt a broader perspective in terms of anticipating risks and challenges for stakeholders in this environment. So that comes from Santos Serrano and Valdez there. So where does this leave us in terms of our particular study and I guess what we were trying to address? So that is a very brief kind of contextual overview there. And as I mentioned, we know that public relations ethics continues to be discussed by scholars and researchers. However, we also know that really, I guess there is a bit of a gap, or we perceive there to be a gap in terms of a comprehensive or an overview and an analysis of the state of the field regarding public relations ethics in recent times. So this is not to say that this has never been done, it has been done, and there are a couple of examples there. So Pratt completed a review that was published in 1994, and more recently, Bowen completed and published a study on behalf of the Institute of Public Relations in 2007. But if we turn our clocks back to 2007, even though it might seem like not that long ago, if we look at the pace of change, particularly with regards to a digital environment and the changes that technology has brought and continues to bring, but also more broadly changes with regards to kind of, globalization 4.0, the next iteration of globalization, issues that have arisen in that time. It really is, I guess, quite a gap given the pace of change and the amount of change that has occurred. So again, certainly we know that the field is alive and well, be that through conceptual and theoretical works. And just one example is Joe Falk's Saints and Sinners from 2012 piece, whether it is broader state of the fields that include ethics but don't focus on ethics. So another example there, Botan and Taylor's 2004 State of the Field mentioned ethics as part of a much broader study. And we also know that discussions of ethics are occurring with regards to specific applications or approaches to public relations. So Hickson in 2004 looked at public relations ethics in Asia, for example. Place more recently in 2015 looked at ethics and program evaluation. So these are just a few of many, many examples that are available. So despite this discussion, we felt that there was a gap really, and that led us to ask, what is the state of public relations, ethics, academic research and scholarship as of, the end of the second decade of the 20th century? What are the key characteristics of this research and scholarship? And I'll unpack that one more in just a tick. And what direction is public relations, ethics, research and scholarship heading in? So characteristics is a bit of, I guess, a grouping of potential, well, there's many different characteristics that we could focus on. And we particularly chose to zero in on where this discussion was happening, both, I guess, in terms of the setting and the location of the scholars, which subdisciplines of public relations this discussion was occurring in, topics and themes that were evident in this discussion, as well as the style and methods of research. We attempted to look at perspectives and philosophical and theoretical alignment, and I'll explain that attempted towards the end of the presentation. And in addition to that, we also looked at interdisciplinarity as well as the idea of translating some of these findings into, I guess, back into practice. So we took a systematic review-based approach, as it says there, really to get what is, I would say, a more objective, I won't say objective, more objective overall assessment of research and scholarship in the field of public relations. Now, within systematic reviews, they themselves have many different variations. So our review most closely aligned to what Victor calls an extended approach that adopts and adapts, I guess, a very traditional sort of approach that was evolved from medicine and healthcare to more of a social sciences application. So you can see the key steps in our review in that little diagram down the bottom there. And that was quite an extensive process that took us quite a few months to work through. And it also included as well some quality assurance checks. And in the data that I am going to present, I'm only going to present that data that met or exceeded the 80% inter-rater reliability benchmark. So our study included 9 journals, which you can see listed on the right-hand side there, and we chose them as a result of preliminary searches, which indicated that that's where the discussion on public relations ethics was concentrated. In terms of our search parameters, we purposefully went broad and used subject level searching around the terms public relations and ethics. Our study encompassed works published between the 1st of January 2000 and the end of 2019, and we only included peer-reviewed articles that were in English. That was really, I guess, a limitation on behalf of the research team, and that English was the only language common to us. And overall, we reached a total sample of 288 articles. And from that, we used a code frame aligned to those different characteristics that I mentioned. And we used both quantitative and qualitative analysis to reveal our findings. So what did we find? We found an awful lot of information. I should mention that there is a longer, more comprehensive paper that is currently under review at the moment that goes into more details. So, as I mentioned, I was keen to kind of keep this to a reasonable length and then encourage some discussion at the end. But if you're interested in more of the nitty-gritty details, then hopefully you'll be able to read the paper in a few months' time. But happily, we can see that the number of publications that discussed public relations ethics actually increased between the first and second decades of this century. If we look at the frequency on a year-by-year basis, we can see a peak that occurred with 25 articles in 2012, down to a low the following year of just 6 articles in 2013. There didn't appear to be any obvious reason for that. And obviously we didn't look at causation, but just hypothesizing, we couldn't see an obvious reason for that. There weren't any special additions, perhaps, that would have explained that peak. But we did think perhaps it was as a consequence of issues such as the Occupy movement, BP's Gulf of Mexico spill, and the global financial crisis that happened in the preceding years, that we just, that was something that we hypothesized could have resulted in that peak. So some good news, public relations ethics scholarship, I think we can conclude, is alive and well and increasing. And this discussion was actually heavily concentrated in two titles, so Public Relations Review and the Journal of Business Ethics. And combined, they actually accounted for more than half of all discussion just in those two titles. Moving on to location and settings. So as I mentioned, we looked at both where the authors writing these works or conducting these research was based, as well as the samples, so the people that they were drawing from to inform empirical research where they were based. And we also took location to mean more the settings, so whether the works or the studies were conducted in professional practice or whether perhaps they were in more of a purely academic kind of setting. So interestingly, we found that more than 3/4 of all works were conducted or written by authors in what we might consider to be typically Western geographies. Almost 59% of articles had first authors located in North America, and 41% of empirical research involving public relations ethics relied on samples also from North America. Now, you'll see this in the next slide, but less than 5% of first authors were from the Middle East, Africa, and Central and South America combined. Interestingly, as well, more than half, so about 60% of all empirical articles published during that entire sample period were conducted in professional or practice-based settings. So we can see here certainly dominance in terms of Western geographies, North America, as well as professional or practice-based settings there. Now, I just wanted to show this slide because this gives a little bit more detail in terms of where this research is occurring. So we've covered off kind of America there being really, I guess, quite dominant in this space. I think it's also interesting just to look briefly at Asia Pacific. So we can see that the amount of research that is being written and published by first authors in Asia Pacific has actually increased. But if we go a little bit further down this table, we can see that not only is the Middle East, Africa, and Central and South America a very small proportion, but if we look at the change in I guess the proportion between decades, we can see that overall that share of voice is getting smaller. So I think to me that was something interesting to note. That I'm keen to get your thoughts on towards the end of this presentation. If we turn our attention to subdisciplines, our research found that most discussion related to public relations ethics was not aligned to a specific subdiscipline, but was really approaching public relations ethics from kind of a generalist perspective or including multiple different subdisciplines. We can see that amongst these different subdisciplines, global or international public relations has held steady at around about 10%. CSR has increased between the first and second decades, and I guess intuitively that mirrors kind of the interest in CSR and I guess continuing rise and uptake of CSR. Interestingly, I guess this study concluded before COVID really kind of visited us in a significant way or impacted our lives in a significant way. But I think it would be interesting to perhaps revisit that crisis communication subdisciplinary finding in a few years' time and see if COVID has perhaps increased our interest and investigation of public relations ethics in that particular subdiscipline. Moving on to topics and themes, and this was really derived through qualitative analysis. We found that discussion could be grouped into two sort of dominant themes with many sub-themes off them there. So public relations more from the perspective of an academic or public relations ethics in the academy, if you like, and that related to topics such as education, professionalisation and codes, as well as theory building. And I guess the second major theme was much more of a practice-based perspective. So that encompassed topics such as management and decision-making, organisational cases and contexts, as well as those specific subdisciplines as well. Now, this slide, I'm going to talk through the graph at the top first and then provide a little bit more detail based on that. But we did look at both the style, so whether works were empirical or more conceptual or philosophical or theoretical. And interestingly, we can see that our discipline with regards to discussion of public relations, ethics and scholarship really became a lot more empirical in between the first and the second decades of this century. And I know that that has been connected to discussions around sort of progress. Certainly, if you take a leaf from more healthcare, health and medicine, the idea of kind of, you know, hierarchies of evidence and sort of empirical research, I guess, perhaps in some ways being viewed more highly than conceptual or theoretical work. That's not my own personal belief, but it's just, you know, perhaps an explanation there. Some people might see that as a mark of progress. If we look now specifically at methods, across the whole sample, just over half of all studies that we included in our sample use quantitative methods. But when we broke that down into a decade by decade basis, there was also a shift away from qualitative methods between the first and the second decades of this century. So within that, surveys and experiments were the most used quantitative methods, and interviews and case studies were the most frequently used qualitative methods. We also looked at interdisciplinarity, whether or not public relations was, I guess, referring to and discussing itself, or whether there was clear interaction between public relations and other disciplines such as healthcare, for instance, technology. Of course, there is going to be a degree of overlap there, but I guess broadly categorising works into inter or intradisciplinary. And again, we found that across the entire sample period, sorry, I'll jump up to the graph there first, my mistake. If we compare between the decades, again, we can see a slight shift towards intradisciplinarity. I guess this means that public relations is drawing from and discussing kind of itself from within its own disciplinary boundaries, rather than kind of integrating theories, as I mentioned, perhaps from healthcare or from technology or from other sort of disciplines that we might consider outside or beyond our own discipline. Now, across the entire sample period, empirical works were more likely to be interdisciplinary than conceptual works. So conceptual works, we were drawing from our own body of knowledge. And again, I think that could be seen as a mark of progress, that the discipline is maturing and developing its own kind of distinctive body of knowledge. I guess as an interdisciplinary researcher, that could pose some risks as well, arguably. Between the first decade of this century, almost a third, so 30% of conceptual, theoretical or philosophical works were intradisciplinary in nature. But by the second decade of this century, almost half of works were intradisciplinary. So just again, highlighting that shift towards our discipline becoming more intradisciplinary. Now we are on the home stretch here, folks. I know it's a lot of data to take in, a lot of stats to take in on grand final day. I don't know, maybe it's just a bit of change in stats from your different footy players and how many goals they've kicked or whatever. But look, we also did look at practical implications. So in our coding framework, we coded articles according to whether there was no or minimal discussion of practical implications, whether there was, I guess, some extent of this discussion, or whether it really was a key focus and there was considerable discussion around the practical implications of the findings. And we found that around about 40% of articles across the whole sample discussed practical implications to no or to a limited extent. So quite a considerable chunk there. Happily, there was around about a quarter of articles that did discuss the practical implications in detail. And among empirical works in a professional or practice-based setting, around about 25% of them discussed those implications in details. And also, I guess another good news story, more articles were discussing their practical implications in detail during the most recent decade of this century. So not a huge shift, but a detectable shift there. So a lot of data, as I mentioned, and I guess this gave us the opportunity, and we are hoping it gives others in the discipline the opportunity to reflect and to consider the body of knowledge as a whole and the state of the field as a whole. So our work presents a comprehensive, systematic investigation and analysis of public relations ethics literature in the first 20 years of this century. It provides insights into the changes that are occurring amongst this body of knowledge and gives us perhaps some insights into the direction that this research is heading in. Importantly, we see our main contribution here as an opportunity for the discipline and the profession to reflect on the state of the field regarding public relations ethics. Are we okay with where we are at with regard to our research and scholarship on public relations ethics and perhaps the direction that we're heading in? Does it align with our discipline's normative principles? And does it reflect broader contextual changes? So a couple of other things that I just wanted to note there. I've just remembered one thing that I missed out and another note around limitations. So interestingly, our study found that you might have noticed in that slide where we talked about topics and themes, and you might have also noticed that I hadn't really discussed digital and social, I guess, public relations ethics in a digital and sort of social media space. We actually found there to be not a huge amount of scholarship and research in that space. It is there, but it is not huge. And that was something that we were quite surprised by, given by, I guess, the volume and the discussion that is occurring, I guess, more in a public domain, and how much, I guess, this has. I know that some people argue that it hasn't changed what we do, but then there are other people who argue that, yes, it absolutely has changed kind of the way that we go about conducting our work. The other thing that I wanted to note was, you might recall when I discussed the different sub-research questions that I said that we attempted to also look at theoretical perspectives and philosophical approaches. We did go through and make an attempt to code whether there was a particular theoretical perspective or whether there was a research was aligned to perhaps a deontological or teleological perspective. We didn't actually meet the quality, or not the quality, the inter-rater reliability thresholds for those points. It was something that it was quite difficult for us to really be able to unpack and to make a clear judgment on. So rather than reporting on data that we didn't kind of felt or we knew according to standards that met that threshold, we made the difficult decision to kind of not include it and report on it in our findings. So in terms of some future opportunities, I think this study has absolutely prompted more questions than what we started with. I think there is an opportunity for further investigation into the ethical and cultural perspectives employed by scholars. So we looked at where scholars were based, their location based on their university affiliation. Obviously, that does not tell us what their kind of perspective is with regards to these topics. So that could be an area for further investigation. I think there is a question around how can we encourage contributions from non-Western samples and geographies. I guess building on that finding that really less than 5% of works were coming from authors from Central and South America, the Middle East and Africa, particularly when we know that public relations is being practiced there. And I guess these cultures have their own ethical traditions and perspectives. So how can we encourage that? How can we ensure that their voices are being heard and their contributions are being included? Also, I think it would be interesting to investigate reasons leading to the prevalence of North American samples and scholarship. There could be some pretty obvious reasons there, but again, I think it would be very interesting to empirically look at that. I think there's a huge opportunity to undertake additional research combining public relations, ethics, and social media platforms, as well as AI. And as I said, that's not to say that it's not there, but I guess as a proportion, it is still quite a small voice. And I think another question remains around how can we best ensure that we translate our findings back into professional settings. So I think it was heartening that so much research is being conducted in professional settings, but it's almost that, I guess, drawing from medicine and healthcare, taking it back from kind of the academic research discipline back into professional practice. I think there's an opportunity for more investigation there. So that brings me to a close from my discussion today. Thank you so much for your attention. And yeah, I'm very happy to have a chat with you. Perhaps we can flick back to some of my questions and or I can address your questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation, Michaela.
Very welcome.
What I can do is bring everybody in so they have the ability to ask you verbally some questions. So I'll just shift them all in and see
no problem
what comes out of it. Don't be shy, you can have a chat with us.
It's nice to see some familiar names popping up there on my Zoom portal. Great. Catherine, looks like you have your hand up.
Hi, Michaela.
Hi, nice to see you. Well,
that was an awesome presentation.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it, and yeah, I just thought it was fantastic. And it's interesting, isn't it, to get that empirical confirmation that the US is definitely kind of just so dominant.
Yes.
And clearly are the gatekeepers for a lot of work as well. But whether there's not enough, it's just, I guess it's also the population there and the legacy of having the programs being the first people to do it.
Yeah.
But so my question was, and I'm not really sure, you said some of the stuff you couldn't actually present because it was, too difficult, but what kind of were the main theories that they were sort of basing their research on, just sort of as a general impression?
Sure. Yep. So we actually use the classification. It's one of those things now where I'm like, it's right on the tip of my tongue and I've completely forgotten exactly who it was, but forgive me for that. I will dive back into the method that I haven't looked at in a couple of months and fish out that information for you. But we based it on, okay, what are the dominant theories within public relations? So there's kind of the systems theory, the functional systems theory, which is kind of your Grunig, your dialogic, that type of approach. Critical, there was postmodern, there was political economy, and I think we had an other category as well. So we absolutely found that, and again, it's something that I can say this in a conversation. I'm not reporting on this kind of empirically as within the paper, but definitely the kind of functionalist systems approach was dominant.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So very much, as you mentioned, that we sort of took it as that legacy of, you know, that school of thought.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just it's interesting because we're obviously trying to write something up as well, and you know, where to go with using theory and related to digital. So yeah, that's great. Thank you.
No worries.
May I ask a question? Sorry, I've finally got the microphone working. Thanks, Michaela. Some great research, really interesting snapshot. I'm interested in how you considered or how you looked at practical implications. You know, what did you see as a practical implication? Did they have to recommend actions, or was it something more general than that?
So I guess that's why we looked at kind of, was there some recommendation or some kind of discussion of translation of implications, or was it done in detail? So I guess, you know, if there were clear steps around, you know, for professional practitioners, this means that, and, you know, if there were clear, tangible steps and there was, you know, a good kind of volume of discussion around that, or it really was even kind of the basis of the paper, that would have been something that where we went, yes, it's discussed to a considerable extent and it's discussed in detail. If there was some mention of it, but more of a, you know, maybe a paragraph that talked about, well, this could be taken on to professional practice and it could be the role of industry associations, etc. That would have been probably in the middle category where, yes, there was some discussion. Where if it was really just a passing comment or there was no mention at all, then that would have been in the, you know, that first category, that kind of 42%, where it was really very, very minimal. Yeah, and I guess it's one of those things as well that we do acknowledge that academic publishing and writing is a genre. And so therefore, you know, you have a limited amount of words to convey your whole kind of, you know, piece of research. And unless, I guess, it's a particular piece focused on translation, or maybe there's a call for papers around translation, you know, you are quite limited. You can be quite limited. So we acknowledge that as well. So I guess it's more just it's a finding rather than a kind of a judgment, if you like. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I have another question, but I'll let someone else ask if there is.
I just have a quick comment on the topic we've been talking about. So it's not really a question, but it prompts some thought about, okay, so I follow that we're all under that pressure of you know, squeezing it into a word limit. But I felt that the journals, and I don't publish that much, but I do, that there was a lot of, I had the impression there was more emphasis on getting acceptance into journals on the basis of, because reviewer feedback, in my anecdotal experience, has been, well, you know, this has got to be beefed up. But anyway, so it's just a comment. I just was surprised a little bit.
Do you mean beefed up in terms of those practical implications?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's you know, I'm delighted to hear that type of thing. It's as a I guess what I have referred to myself as a pracademic, someone who's come from practice into kind of academia. That's not my term. I owe that one to Ingrid Larkin at QUT. But you know, I'm delighted to hear that. But it is encouraging for me that, you know, there still is, you know, 25% of articles kind of discussing these implications in a good amount of detail is not to be sneezed at type of thing, where I think, you know, certainly, and look, I have done research, and health communication is kind of one of my interests. So I know that, you know, the idea of translation in medicine and healthcare is kind of very strong. So I think, you know, we need to consider our discipline's background. We need to consider the limitations of publishing. And I think we need to also recognise that 25% is not to be sneezed at. And not only that, but it's increasing. So I think that, you know, I'm heartened by your experience, Chris, and I think there is an indication in the data that we found that, you know, it is heading in that direction.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
We do have one from Rob in our Q&A section.
Sure.
He says, did you take into account the Code of Ethics for Professional Practitioners, Global Alliance, the PRIA, etc., and potential breaches in your research?
So look, I guess we didn't specifically search for that. I think, as I mentioned in the search terms, they were purposefully broad, and that's probably another thing to note is that because we were looking at the state of the field, we use subject terms, and I guess that's another limitation in the sense that because we use papers that mentioned those terms, there were papers in there that mentioned ethics, but where it wasn't kind of the overall focus of the paper. So I would say to Rob that should have been included. Certainly if you like, the professionalisation agenda has close connections to the idea of ethics, and that was a theme that came through in the qualitative analysis. We didn't kind of get as granular as looking at the connections back to the Global Alliance, but again, you know, another great opportunity for future inquiry there. Oh, Prue, I can see your hand up. Hello, nice to see you.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, good. Great to reconnect.
Fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
I'm just kind of interested in your perspective on one of the questions you've got on that so what slide there, that are we okay with where we're at and the direction we're heading in? I guess as, you know, the educators of the future PR professionals, what are your thoughts on that question?
Great question, and great question back to me. Look, I'm a mixed bag. I'm very okay with some of it and very not okay with some of it. I'm very okay with the fact that public relations ethics continues to be a discussion that is lively, that is growing in interest, that is represented by empirical and conceptual works, and that has representation from voices and samples all around the world. So I think that is great, and that gives me encouragement. I'm pretty not okay with the comparative share of voice coming from the Global South. I think it's interesting. I think it was, the comment was made around, you know, if we look at kind of where the population is in terms of North America, I understand the legacy argument, but if we look in terms of total population, I mean, Africa, Central and South America, the Middle East, these are massive populations that are engaging with public relations as a practice and a discipline. And to me, I'm pretty not okay with that representation. I think that is a concern. I'm also pretty not okay with the rapid shift towards intradisciplinarity. I am an interdisciplinary scholar. My PhD was purposefully interdisciplinary, and that to me is a cause for concern, particularly when we know the benefits of diversity, not just diversity of kind of demographics, but cognitive diversity. I think it can, as I mentioned, it can be seen as a positive step or a positive sign of maturity in the discipline. But it really concerns me when we do have those normative principles around contextual intelligence and boundary spanning, if we don't maintain them within our public relations ethics research that we're doing. So that concerns me. And as a qualitative researcher as well, I also I advocate for the continuation of qualitative methods around ethics. I don't think it's disappearing, but I think that we need to keep a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of knowledges. So I think that's, they would be kind of, I think for me, what I am okay with and what for me is cause for concern. And I think also, like I mentioned, massive opportunity for additional research into the whole digital sphere and what that means in terms of public relations ethics. Not just for our discipline, but I think given some of those normative principles around public relations, I think we could be a much stronger voice, a much more stronger advocates of kind of ethics on those topics. So there you go, a very long-winded answer for you, Prue.
It was a great answer.
May I ask another question then, Michaela?
Of course.
Can you tell me, maybe more on the qualitative side of the research, were there particular themes that came out of it, such as truth or codes of ethics, or even places, you know, government versus corporate, etc.?
Yes.
Big feelings around that.
So absolutely, I'm just fishing out my notes which has more information about that. And full disclosure, Ella, my colleague, was the one who did the qualitative analysis for this. So she would be the one who can give you sort of the really nitty-gritty answer here. But the short answer was that yes, definitely those concepts around kind of truth and trust, which we have seen the discipline kind of I'm going to say positively grapple with for a while, but they were evident in there. I'm not as confident that there was as much division kind of between, say, business and non-profit. I know that both were represented, but I couldn't speak right now. It might have to be a question on notice that I take and get back to you.
Yep.
But yeah, definitely sort of those issues around truth and trust were represented in there.
Okay, thanks.
I'll just quickly refer to a comment made by Marianne here.
Yes.
And you have touched upon on this, so it has been, but I think it's an interesting one. You talked about it just a moment ago, that she's made the comment here that there is more needed with PR ethics research to be done in the space of social media and AI. I guess you mentioned digital media. It does stand out as a bit surprising, since you've made the point, Michaela, that it's become, well, I'll use the word ubiquitous at the moment, but it's surprising not to see a bit more happening in this area.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So I think, again, it's not to say that there was nothing. I think it's just something that, given how rapidly the change has been, that we felt there was a gap there. I know there have been comments made by other scholars around the fact that, you know, public relations sort of research and scholarship has been sort of falling behind, or is in a bit of a state of catch up. I think there are a few reasons or a few possible reasons for that. We all know how long it takes to produce academic research. So I think it's reasonable to expect that there is kind of a lag between what people are actively working on and just how long that publication process takes. So certainly there are articles that have come out since this review was done. And look, we did the searches in sort of mid of 2019. So even if we look at those past couple of years, there have been, you know, further research coming out in that space. So I think that could be a possible explanation there. There also has been comments that sort of discussions around sort of AI, social media. It's been more of, I guess, the focus has been on the how-to, or kind of the very pragmatic codes of ethics and kind of those how-to approaches and the ethical implications, perhaps rather than some kind of I guess more overall macro level considerations of kind of what does this mean for society type of thing. So I know that those discussions do exist. I think it's also something as well that any systematic review is in a sense the victim of its own search terms and the victim of the platforms that you use and the parameters that you put in. So you know, I'm reporting on the results as we found them according to our methodology. If people didn't use the term public relations and ethics, for instance, then in their papers, then that wouldn't have come up. So we use those terms based on some preliminary searches, and we found them to be kind of, you know, to capture most of the discussion, but I guess there are a couple of papers that we're aware of that didn't specifically mention those terms and that were excluded. So yes, we felt it was surprising. We felt it, given the the extent and the pace of the change, that it would be a positive thing if there is more discussion there. And I certainly know the likes of Anne Gregory and Claire Bourne with regard to AI have made, you know, similar calls for much more emphasis there. But there are some kind of other reasons as well that might explain that finding.
It was interesting, your comment about using public relations and ethics.
Yeah.
Do you think much would have changed if you'd looked at communication as well as public relations?
Possibly. I think it could well have done so, but I guess it is sort of that Venn diagram in the terms of, and we also did some experimenting around perhaps using ethics and ethical, for instance. So, you know, there is that crossover that if you're talking about public relations, to what extent are you also likely to refer to communication in there? So, but look, that's a great point, and it would be interesting to kind of perhaps replicate it around communication ethics, and see what that brings up as well and what the differences are.
I just wanted to make a comment too, Michaela, that this is fantastic empirical stuff to use when we are pitching for a journal article, you know, doing an abstract or even writing a full article and putting it in. So I was hoping to quote you or cite you.
Sure.
Using the talk. So I think, you know, all that, if you are pitching to a North American based journal, they can't argue with these facts.
Yes,
empirical research. So yeah.
Yes, and it was you know, whereby it was quite tricky at times to look through and go, you know, what philosophical paradigm is this most aligned to, or, you know, is this normative or is this positive or is it bits of both? You know, something like a location of an author and the university that they are affiliated with, from this kind of cut and dry, in essence, you know, systematic review, it's pretty easy to kind of go North America, tick the box, or Africa, tick the box. So yeah, I'm glad that will be helpful for you. And as I said, hopefully in a few months we'll have a brand new shiny journal article that you can refer to as well.
Well, thank you once again, Michaela, and representing your co-authors so well.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you to Ella and Marianne for all their continuing hard work on this one. And thank you for your interest and your great questions. And yeah, let's hope it fosters more discussion.
Wonderful. I think we'll wrap up and let everyone have the rest of their afternoons.
Fantastic. Sounds good to me.
No worries. Enjoy your public holiday.
Will do. Will do.
Keep an eye on the stats for the football.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I'll get my Excel spreadsheet going.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much.
No worries. Bye.
See you.